You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
And welcome once again to a fact and hopefully phantom-filled episode of Haunted Histories here on Parasearch Radio. As always, yours truly, Penny G. Morgan, will guide us through the trials and tribulations and hopefully give you a bit of an insight into the topic at hand. So where are we going to visit today and who might be joining us? Well, I'm quite excited to say that finally I'm going to be able to talk about another site close to where I live, somewhere called the Royal Gunpowder Mills in Waltham Abbey. But before that, I need to revisit last week's show on Warwick Castle and the War with the Roses. Now, I mentioned that as my parents are from opposing sides of the Pennines, that growing up felt like the War of the Roses going on in my head. You may have remembered me saying that. Well, I'm flattered to say that my parents actually listened to my show. To be fair, they do listen to a fair few of my productions, but they just don't actually tell me unless something has come up in it they feel they need to mention. And they wanted to make it clear to anyone listening, or anyone who chooses to listen, that whilst they may have been born as roses of different colours, one being white and one being red, they have just celebrated their golden wedding anniversary. So obviously the mixture of Lancaster and York has worked for them, and they wanted to make a point of the fact that it was just me being sarcastic, the warring side, and that they didn't war, and obviously something's worked for them. They've made it to their golden wedding anniversary in 50 years, and it was actually only a month ago, so congratulations to my parents for that one. All I have to say to them is, Mum, Dad, you'd get less for murder, so think about that one. Anyway, the other reason I am excited is that the history side today that we're going to be talking about is something that I have been longing to get a chance to investigate and research and put something together on for some time now. And it's to do with the women in World War I. More specifically, women who are known as munitionettes. So you're going to get a double whammy from me. Not only am I going to be grinning like a Cheshire cat, because I'm going to be able to talk about a collection of buildings that I absolutely adore, but also about a period of history which I find totally intriguing and one that a lot of people don't always consider. Now, most people think that women didn't really start doing the kind of hard graft type work until about 25 years later during World War II. But that wasn't actually the case. World War I was really the first chance that your average woman, and not so average, it has to be said, got the opportunity to shine in what had been perceived prior to that as purely a man's world. Prior to that, all that women could choose to do, probably as a vocation, would be things like being a governess or being a nurse. And it was quite obvious, though, that once you got married, you had to give up your career because your job was to look after your husband and to raise any potential offspring that you may have. But this whole change to the work environment, I guess, for want of a better term, wasn't actually immediate. In the first few months of World War One, the woman's place was seen to be standing stoically at the window, holding on to the children whilst watching the men march bravely off to the front and off to battle. Women were also encouraged to question why your best boy is not in khaki, the onus being on the women to challenge why their husband or loved one was not doing their bit for the war effort. So much so that women started gathering in the street, presenting men who weren't in uniform with white feathers as a mark of perceived cowardice. Unfortunately, some of these white feathers were actually given to men who were very much part of the war effort but just happened to be in their civilian clothes. But that was all women were seen to be good for back then. It could be said, however, that it was actually the suffragette movement who placed their campaigns for votes for women on hold for a slight while and focused instead on what women could do to aid the war effort. I'm actually going to skip past some of the things that were offered and subsequently declined by the men who were running things, such as Dr. Elsie Inglis, who was the founder of an all-female, very early all-female medical unit, the Scottish Women's Hospitals, being told when she had gone into the offices to try and offer her services as a doctor and offer the services of her staff as medical experts to, my good lady, go home and sit still. No petticoats here. What an amazing view to have, really, that one of the pioneering doctors of her age was told to go away and basically sit still in her petticoats. She didn't. But I'm sure we'll look at the medical side of World War One at some point, because there's an awful lot of very, very interesting things that happened with female staff back then. It wasn't actually until the 17th of March 1915 that the Board of Trade issued an appeal to women everywhere to register for war service work. This was paid work and could be industrial, agricultural or clerical. But they also clarified that it could involve light machining for armaments. Now, over 20,000 women applied for work, but the male bosses were, shall we say, a bit slow on the take-up. The attitudes to women working was still pretty darned archaic. Things like taxis and tram lines and everything said that having women working in them was actually going to be dangerous and was going to cause an accident. They did have to change their minds subsequently, and there was even female police officers. Shock. Horror. Further events, though, in 1915 did change this outlook, I guess you could say, with what's known as the Shells scandal in 1915. This was after Sir John French, who was actually the British Commander-in-Chief, stated that, in his opinion, a shortage of munitions had led directly to the British offensive at Neuve-Chapelle in the March of that year failing. This, positively good, I guess, had the desired effect and kick-started the employment of more women in jobs that had previously been purely a male domain. Obviously, it wasn't just the increased production required in things like munitions that led to women being included, but the fact that a lot of them, the male staff, had actually gone off to fight and do their bit for king and country. The numbers needed to swell even further with the introduction of conscription in 1916, which also gave the women the chance to relocate for the work, which was a massive social change for women, especially single women who ordinarily would have just accepted work in wherever their family was based. Munitions work didn't just apply to things that went bang. It was actually anything that involved what they call feeding the guns of war, so to speak. Anything from the obvious, from stuffing gun shells with TNT, cordite, whatever it was, which we'll touch on later, to actually manufacturing the wooden crates that these explosives would be shipped out to the boys on the front in. That said, however, but the largest number of women in munitions were definitely, most definitely, in the manufacture of explosives, gun shells, small arms ammunitions, and the shell filling factories. The factories producing these items had grown in size to increase productions, and a government scheme saw what was called super factories of an unprecedented volume being constructed to accommodate the demand. Two of the main explosive factories were Pembury in Wales and Silvertown in London. Yes, the same place as the 1917 explosion, which we will mention again shortly, took place. That's a bit of a test for you, so if you were listening to my talk on the docks a couple of weeks ago, you would have heard me mention Silvertown then, because it was right by the docks. But don't worry, I'm not going to test you. I will mention a lot of the fundamental details again. But if you do want to learn a bit more, re-listen to the dock show, because we did talk about it quite in depth in that one. Anyway, who were the munition girls? Well, as with a lot of things, especially back in the early 1900s, class played a big part in what role you had during the war. Middle and upper class girls, who tended to be deemed as nice girls, were guided and steered towards more nursing or women's service type vocations, whereas munitions girls were predominantly from domestic service backgrounds, so what would have been perceived to be the more working class and possibly even lower middle class upbringings. Physical fitness was a big factor in these kind of munition roles. The days were long, normally 12-hour shifts, and factories were running 24 hours a day. But even as now, this hasn't changed. There was a massive disparity in pay, with men earning sometimes 3 times that of the women workers for doing the same role with the same level of danger. Although back then, a lot of women didn't really mind, as it was the first time they had earned wages as high as what they were earning, even if they weren't at the same level as the male workers who remained, who hadn't gone away to fight on the front. These factories were incredibly dangerous places to be. By the middle of the war, it is estimated that there were some 75,000 women employed in the munitions industry, producing millions of shells and small arms ammunition every single year. But the risk was ever present. In each major filling factory, there would be separate work departments. One could be making, say, detonators, and another one, for example, filling the fuses, another one blending gunpowder, etc. These groups would be situated at geographically different areas, but all within the designated danger area of the factory, normally with a light railway system running between them, to try and avoid any kind of contamination and possibly mitigate any potential danger, or, I suppose, catalyst that could cause further explosions if one place had a problem. Well, I mentioned danger. You probably remember what I said about Silvertown, where 50 tons of TNT exploded in 1917, killing over 70 people and injuring hundreds and hundreds more. In June of 1917, an explosion at a TNT factory in Ashton-under-Lyme killed 43 and injured many more. In Chilwell, near Nottingham, in 1918, 134 people were killed in an explosion. In Leeds' Barnbow filling factory, 1916, 35 women were killed. And this was the first major loss of female civilians in the war up to that point. Barnbow had 2 further explosions with a total further loss of life of 5. 5 more people. In Faversham in Kent, an explosion in 1916 killed over 100 and was heard as far away as Norwich in Norfolk, hundreds of miles away. It even blew out the windows in Southend-on-Sea, which was just across the estuary. And this explosion was actually due to a fire, a small fire, which hadn't been extinguished properly a few days prior and had kept smouldering and caused massive destruction and loss of life. I believe the one in Faversham has actually got a monument there now for the loss of life, as so many of these places and explosions and industrial incidents were kept secret. at the time for fear of alerting the Germans to the locations of our munitions factories, and also for them to get wind of perhaps maybe a delay in manufacture of explosives. It was also seen to be something which could damage troops' morale if they got wind of. Because if you thought you've got no explosives to combat the barrage that's coming across at you, it might be a pretty desperate situation. Even though this might be incredibly temporary, because one thing we do know is, as happened with World War II as well, these kind of drops in development didn't last for very long, and the building work was done and dusted very, very quickly to get these factories up and running again. A lot of these events only became known relatively recently in history, when the records were unsealed and stopped having to abide by the Official Secrets Act. But explosions and instant death wasn't the only danger that these women workers, and to be fair, the male workers who remained, faced. The women became known as something called the Canary Girls, because the overexposure to the chemicals in TNT, and also cordite to an extent. Now, does anyone know, I'm going to try and impress you now, does anyone know what TNT actually stands for? Well, it stands for trinitrotoluene. Trinitrotoluene. I think that almost sounds like a sort of a planet from Star Wars, Toluene, because toluene is actually a chemical in its own right. So it's probably much easier to call it TNT. But if you end up doing a pub quiz and they ask you, what is commonly known as trinitrotoluene, you'll be able to answer TNT. Maybe I'll test that one on you on that one later in a few weeks, see if you can remember what trinitrotoluene is. Anyway, it's toxic, the inherent chemicals in it. And if exposed to it for long periods of time, it would turn the skin yellow and the hair an orangey ginger colour. It was also actually toxic to the liver, causing anemia and jaundice. Jaundice even. I haven't been drinking, I promise. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe I need to drink a few, and at least a coffee, if nothing else. Anyway, munitionette Caroline Rennies later recalled that, so it was all bright ginger, all our front hair, you know, because they would have had caps on. These women had these sort of drawstring caps on, which if you Google images of the munitionettes from World War I, you can see the clothes that they were expected to wear at work. And all our faces were bright yellow. They used to call us the canaries. Some of them used to look at us as though we were insects. Do you know what I mean? And others used to mutter, "Ah, well, they're doing their bit." As I say, some were quite nice, and others, well, used to treat us as though we were scum of the earth. Of course, all our clothes we couldn't wear good clothes because the powder used to seep into them. You know what I mean? Another Canary girl, Ethel Dean, related in an interview archived by the Imperial War Museum that everything that powder touches goes yellow. All the girls' faces were yellow, all around their mouths. They had their own canteen at work, in which everything was yellow that they touched. Everything went yellow. Chairs, tables, everything. It's actually a fact now that the prolonged exposure to the yellow TNT, the trinitrotoluene, even caused some to give birth to yellow babies because so much of it had been inhaled. These women would be expected to wear specific clothes for work and issued with wooden-soled clogs, as anything metal could cause a spark. Some, depending on the department that they worked in, even had to wear fabric slippers or rubber gumboots. They would be given flame-retardant canvas or twill overalls and a drawstring hat, as I mentioned earlier. That's why only their fringes or any hair that was protruding from the hat would go orange. But they would have none of the safety equipment that we would expect today for working with such toxic and potentially volatile chemicals. Many of these women, and which I think is a bad thing, have never received the recognition some might say they deserve for working in such dangerous conditions. I appreciate that these women weren't at the front line, they weren't being shot at, they probably weren't even in sort of immediate danger as much as, say, nursing staff were who were working in the frontline hospitals, what are known as the fannies or the ambulance drivers, but they were definitely in some kind of danger the risk of explosions or accidents any day. And the odd case of bravery does prevail and were given prominence by the powers that be. A 17-year-old by the name of Mabel Lethbridge was actually given a CBE. She was one of 5 munitionettes operating an Amatol shell filler at a factory in Middlesex. She lost a leg and suffered multiple other injuries when the machine itself malfunctioned. The other women who were with her were, and this is gruesome, so I do apologise, but they were instantly incinerated. It was only her 9th day in the job. She actually applied her own tourniquet to her leg, and they reckon that's what probably saved her life and stopped her bleeding out. But this is what's so amazing, is she had lied about her age so that she could work. And what did this mean? Well, it meant that the so grateful British nation refused her an invalidity pension because she had been below the age when she'd started the job. That meant she didn't qualify for one. Disgusting, really. But there you go. But what does the Royal Gunpowder Mills have to do with these pretty amazing Canary girls, these amazing women? Well, the first records of gunpowder being created at these mills dates back as far as 1665, where the parish records showed that 2 people had been killed in one of what's called a powder mill. Situated in the Lee Valley, the area was a perfect location to harness the natural power of water to grind and process the various ingredients required to create the explosives. And at one point at Waltham Abbey, there were around 13 different mills producing gunpowder, and using the water to transport the goods as well as aid in the manufacture. However, from the late 1780s, the Crown took over from a family known as the Waltons. I kid you not, good night, John Boy, in the running of the area of the site. The amount of product coming from the mills always really depended on whether the country was at war or not. Quite logically, I guess. The mills expanded volume, output and quantity during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars from 1789, culminating in the victory at Waterloo in 1815. It was during this time that the first really big death toll from explosive incidents occurred, November 1811. In the number 4 press house, 7 men were killed instantly. The foreman died 2 weeks later, so that's a death of 8. That's a toll of 8. There were definitely explosions and fatal accidents before this point, but they just weren't recorded as well, and therefore the details are not as accessible. A period of quiet on the war front, with a steep decline in staff numbers and production levels in the mid-19th century, ended when conflict broke out again in 1854 with the Crimean War in Russia. We mentioned the Crimea when we talked about St Thomas's Hospital and Florence Nightingale. It's all linking together, isn't it? Anyone would think I planned it this way. 1843. Another 7 men die from 4,000 pounds of gunpowder exploding in the Corning House. What is the Corning House, I hear you say? Come on, someone shout at me. What is the Corning House? Well, corning is when the raw gunpowder is turned into much more stable grains. The uncorned gunpowder can actually be very, very volatile. So corning it is a method of making it more useful and more volatile. In 1894, a hospital was erected nearby on the grounds to help with any future accidents, giving the poor unfortunates involved much, much faster access to the medical care available at that time. The Indian Mutiny and a succession of colonial conflicts followed, culminating in the Boer War of 1899 to 1902. That's actually a war we haven't covered yet. We probably will. We've got the time. I'm just not sure when, but I'm sure we will. By this time, so by the time of the Boer War, smokeless propellants such as cordite were being developed and produced for Army and Navy guns to prevent their position from being given away when fired. This is what was produced in abundance for the First World War. Now this is fascinating. I think it's fascinating that despite during World War II the production was at its peak with 200 tons. Yeah, I'm not joking there. 200 tons of cordite being made a week. There was only one fatal explosion, and only one person died in that whole period. It's pretty amazing. However, during World War II, things were very different. The mills were to suffer possibly the worst spell of fatalities in its entire existence. From January to April of 1940, there were at least 3 major incidents due to cordite manufacture, when the nitroglycerine is dropped onto gun cotton, both of which are incredibly unstable chemicals. The first explosion in the January of 1940 was felt by the seismic meters in Kew Gardens. 3 poor men who died instantly. They wouldn't have even had time to think about it. Probably didn't even have time to take in what was happening as the thousands of pounds of those unstable ingredients exploded. Now, if you ever go to the Royal Gunpowder Mills, and I would recommend it, it's an interesting day out, and it's good for children as well. There's loads of stuff there to do for all age groups. And if you and your husband decide to have a shoot-off with the guns that are out in the main car park, be warned, because husbands tend to sulk when they lose to their wife, the Annie Oakley of Essex. Anyway, there's loads of things that they built, like different concrete alleyway, sort of, I suppose, trenches, for want of a better word, that are meant to deflect any kind of blast from these different pressing houses, corning houses, mills, and everything else. But the blast from this explosion in the January followed a trajectory and found a handcart which contained 640 pounds of gun cotton, so one of the raw ingredients used to make cordite. The explosion threw the 2 workers who were pushing the handcart into the air, and upon landing caused them fatal injuries. It was almost like a fuse, the trajectory that followed, because other parts of the mills also exploded, but the death count remained quite low at 5, which, considering the destruction, and you can Google it and you can find the photos showing the destruction, it's pretty amazing. Where the initial explosion was, where those 3 men died immediately, was nothing but a crater. That's how big the explosion was. The death count was a lot lower than perhaps it should have been, and they believe that this in part was due to the fact that many men were actually on their breaks, so weren't at their stations. Another month, 1 month later, another explosion, although fortunately this one wasn't fatal. But in April there was a fatality with the death of 5 more men. Maybe the powers that be learned, whichever the word should be, from these experiences though, as it remained pretty accident-free until the end of the war, with the end of production of weaponry in 1945. It was actually after the Second World War that the site became a research centre for rocket propellants, even having a hand in the rocket cartridges used for aircraft ejector seats, interestingly enough. In 1991 it shut its doors, and it became the amazing and vast visitor attraction we see today. What I find interesting, and I'm going to touch on this as well after the break, is that the mills have no feeling of aggression or maybe a warlike feel that some military establishments have that I visited. Maybe it's because, and this is documented, that those who worked there during these peak times, especially World War I, felt that they were aiding in ending the war as opposed to prolonging it. So they were almost trying to create weaponry to influence peace. Anyway, there you go. There's a brief history of the Royal Gunpowder Mills and the amazing munitionettes, the Canary Girls. Shortly, we'll be looking at some recounts of paranormal events there that I've found from various sources, and also my experiences of being there last year, and some of the perhaps strange emotions that the building produces. Stay with me. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back shortly.
Hello. Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
And welcome back to part 2 of this show on the Royal Gunpowder Mills in Waltham Abbey. Now, the first half we were looking at a bit of the history and what happened at the mills and some of the horrific accidents that took place there. But one of the things I did say is that when I've visited there, I suppose as your average punter during the day, I didn't feel it was particularly an aggressive place, whereas some of the forts and other military establishments that I've been to had a lot more, I suppose, ill feeling associated with them. That's the only way I can think to describe it. Maybe it's because this was an establishment where things were made as opposed to people who were going to be using them to fight with were based, but that I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that one. But, funnily enough, it's not a place that has got an awful lot of, if you like, paranormal recorded history. And it's also a place that's gone through quite a lot of periods when they haven't allowed paranormal investigations to take place. And it's only recently, as the ownership and whether it was going to be shut down seems to have settled down, that they've started reopening it to groups. So I do think it might be somewhere we revisit maybe next year, once it's had quite a few more investigations done, and hopefully I can get on one as well as a proper investigation, and I come back to you with actual experiences and evidence, like EVPs and those kind of things. But one of the things that the site itself has been used for a lot is sort of historical military type of reenactments, and I found this on a chat page, a paranormal chat page about the Royal Gunpowder Mills. Now, I can't find the name of the person who posted it, so I can't actually give them any credit for what they've put. So, if this was you, and by some strange turn of coincidence you're actually listening, please do let us know so that we can give you the credit. But anyway, I'm going to read through what this person has put actually on this chat room. So, this happened middle of last year, 2005. I can't remember the date, probably not long before I started this thread. A historical group I'm with were doing a show at the Gunpowder Mills. On the last night, most people had already packed up and gone home, leaving only around 20 to 30 of us camping until the next morning. Sometime after dark, we were all sitting around an open fire, having a few drinks. No, we weren't all drunk. And chatting, when one of the girls, I'll call her C, briefly saw somebody standing in the upstairs windows of one of the buildings about 30 to 50 yards away. Some of us went to see who it was, thinking it was one of the kids that should have been in bed messing about, but it didn't come as any great surprise that there was nobody there, and there was no way anybody could have got out of the building before the guys got to the doors. Another friend, I'll call her M, and I didn't see this. We'd wandered off to the loo or to get some more beer, but as the girl involved knows, we're both quite sensitive to odd goings-on. It was us that spent the next hour or so persuading C that her tent, which she was sharing with her brother, which was actually by these buildings, was perfectly okay, and that whatever she'd seen didn't ever leave the building that she'd seen it in. I knew my friend M was lying as soon as she said that, but it seemed to calm C's nerves quite a bit. So eventually she decided she wanted to go to bed, but didn't want to walk to the tent by herself. Now, Em and I had been to the Gunpowder Mills before with the group, and had camped in a completely different area, and we'd both had the distinct feeling we were being watched, but didn't know until we were talking after this particular night that we were both being watched from the same place, a small group of trees off to one side, near where the public come into the Gunpowder Mills. And this is really why Em and I weren't as bothered about being watched as our friend C had been. Anyway, back to this story. Em and I walked C back to her tent where we stood chatting for a while. It wasn't completely dark as there was quite a full moon, and we were still not far from the campfire where everybody else was still sitting, and it was a fair-sized fire giving off quite a lot of light. C was standing with her back to the tent, and Em and I were standing either side of her, facing each other. Whilst we were talking, I looked up to see a shadow run across the front of the building where C had seen the figure in the upstairs window towards us. This made me jump, and must have made me stop talking mid-sentence. Something has to, they've put in brackets. I immediately looked towards the fire to see if it could have been somebody there that had cast the shadow, but the only person standing was chopping wood for the fire. Then, looking at the shadow he was casting, I realised there was no way it could have been anybody close to the fire. His shadow was very elongated and blurry, as if it was being cast along the ground from the fire, but the running figure had been very crisp and distinct against the wooden sidings of the building. Em had noticed my reaction and asked what was wrong. So as not to frighten C, I said that I thought I'd seen something, but that it was only a shadow from the guy cutting wood. We talked a little bit more, then wandered back with Em assuring C that whoever she'd seen never left this building, which was about 3 metres away from C's tent. When we were about halfway back, Em said, "Don't you hate lying to people?" So I replied, "What you mean, like he never leaves the other building?" She smiled and answered, "Yeah, and things like, what you saw was the only one of the guy cutting wood." After we got back to camp and talked, she told me that she had seen the same running figure as she was facing me when she'd seen him carry on running past the back of C's tent and along the line of the buildings until there was no firelight to cast a shadow. Interesting. Maybe it was someone running away from an explosion, because they don't say which of the buildings it was that this figure was seen in. But when you think of the level of explosions and people running away from them that they would have been, running away fast wouldn't be surprising. It does make you wonder if this would be some kind of residual energy, or like stone tape type theory, or if it would have been an interactive spirit who could have communicated with them, but they'd spooked, being maybe a bit loud or having a fire going or whatever, when in a gunpowder mill, an open fire would have been, well, suicide, to be quite honest. When I sort of was researching for this actual show, I did sort of contact a few of the groups that, and there isn't many, who have actually investigated the gunpowder mills properly. And one of the groups that came back to me, and I really appreciate this, is a group called the Ghost Hunt Events. Now, Steve, the managing director of Ghost Hunt Events, sent me a really long email of summary of some of the events and activities that they have experienced when they've investigated the gunpowder mills. Now, one of the things he wants to say is, because they're a commercial ghost hunting team and not a private paranormal investigation group, a lot of the activity, they don't record it in the same way that a specialist sort of private paranormal investigating group would be, to feed back the evidence and to show people what they've experienced. So a lot of it was just what the different members of the group had reported, and maybe some of the things members of the public had said to them. But they don't actually ask members of the public to actually relay back what their experiences are, because they feel that it's there for them to experience rather than for people to come in and be influenced as to what they might experience, which I agree with completely, Steve. I think there's too much people go to expect something, and obviously going to somewhere that was a gunpowder mills, you'd expect there to be sort of death and destruction and all this, with the amount of the hundreds of people that have died in these kind of places through accidents. But I also think it's interesting when I see bits of evidence that actually correlate with personal experiences or with other experiences that I've read. Anyway, when Steve's group, Ghost Hunt Events, last went to the gunpowder mills, and they do have other investigations coming up there, it is worth pointing out. So if you do actually want to go on an investigation with the Ghost Hunt group, please do actually go and look on their Facebook page, because as I said, they've been incredibly helpful to me when I needed to find some evidence, and some evidence fast. So have a look at Ghost Hunt events on Facebook, and I'm sure you'll find something of interest. In fact, they're actually doing a Gunpowder Mills ghost investigation on July the 29th, if you're looking to go on one. And they have done a few previously as well. Hopefully, Steve has said they'll be doing some more in 2018. So I think I'm going to be getting my name down for that one when it happens, so that A, I can meet them properly and say thank you, and B, that I can see what I can experience at night when we haven't got all the other members of the public chatting to us. Is that fair to say? Chatting to us? Anyhow, what they said was that within the museum they made lots of contact using things like Ouija boards and electronic equipment like K2s and ghost boxes. And that's actually something else that I've seen in evidence that I sort of found on things like YouTube and different paranormal websites, that it seems to be that the spirit boxes or ghost boxes, whatever you call them, seem to get an awful lot of activity in this place. It's funny really, because with ghost boxes you either get loads of activity or none. And I know there's an awful lot of people who don't think ghost boxes are actually worth the plastic they're put in, really. But I've had some quite amazing experiences with them that I wouldn't have been able to, that weren't been able to manipulate. And the interesting thing is that a lot of the reports I read from the Royal Gunpowder Mills says there's a very heavy female presence there. A very heavy female presence. Which, when you look back to what we said about the Canary Girls and the fact that they were pioneers for women in their day, and a lot of them might even have enjoyed the work they were doing because it was giving them a sense of responsibility and money that they'd never had before. So maybe that's why they come back and are sensed so much with the electronic equipment like Ouija boards and everything else. Steve tells me they also use your much more traditional equipment, such as dowsing rods and pendulums, and a lot of people like to do table tipping, as that seems to be one of the favoured paranormal experiments of this day when you go to places like this. What's interesting is that he said that in the mixing sheds, the storage sheds and the old mills, a lot of the EVPs recorded voices, albeit they can't really tell at this stage what the voices were saying, but there was definitely a hum of voices and footsteps being heard when none of the members of the public were moving and nobody could be seen. He did say that they're still, from their last visit there in May, they are still sort of going through the EVPs that they did actually record, because they did find quite a lot. And he has said that if he finds anything, he'll be more than happy to let me know, so we can feature it on a future episode. Ghost Hunt Events will be actually doing a show with us later in the year in November on one of the forts, on the Landguard Fort in Felixstowe. So if you do have any questions for them on the Gunpowder Mills, fire away and we'll feed them back to them. Anyway, so they did get in the typical places where work would have been quite sort of ordered, and there would have been an awful lot of strict routines to stick to and strict procedures to stick to in places like the mills and the mixing sheds, because one more small mistake and you blow the whole place up, as I said in my history bit when I was talking about the manufacturing of things like cordite, which was dripping nitroglycerine onto gun cotton, and that's where a lot of the big explosions happened. But what he said is that with these footsteps there was definitely a feeling of people walking around. In the old, what is the old fire station, which is now the Mad Lab for children to experiment in, I said to you this was a good place to visit for all ages. My kids love it there. The experiments that the mad professor, the mad scientist gets them doing are fascinating. And I think last time I went there was even, for older children, they could have Nerf wars. You know, those Nerf gun things in where what looked like almost like cells, which apparently is in the old fire station. Now, Steve tells me that a lot of people are often touched in the fire station bit, with their bums being pinched. And a male fireman has been seen. And they do think this dirty fireman is the responsible for pinching people's bottoms. I can't say I had my bottom pinched when I was there. I was too busy trying to stop my children plaguing the scientist to make more goo that he was teaching them to make. But it definitely had a weird feeling in that place. You did feel as though you weren't on your own, even though there was 3 or 4 of you there. You felt there was an awful lot more people buzzing around you. That's the only way I can explain it. Customers have also reported to have seen female figures wandering around the site. Many report that there are 2 female workers. Now, whether these were canary girls, because it was really from World War One that women would have first started working in a place like the Royal Gunpowder Mills. Now, what's interesting is that when I went there, and this is going to sound like I just want to talk about myself, and I promise I don't, but when you have an experience, you want to relay it. When I went there, again, I felt it a very peaceful place. I didn't feel, even walking past some of the areas where there had been horrific deaths, with people being basically blown to pieces and not even knowing, being literally evaporating into the ether. The explosions were so violent. It was still a very, very peaceful, easygoing, gentle and relaxed vibe about it. My husband had taken our older son off. I think they'd gone to the mad lab, or they'd gone to look at some rocket propulsion experiment that they were doing. And I had my 2-year-old with me, because he wouldn't have appreciated that, and he was quite happy just sitting in his pushchair walking along the canal. Now, the canal was used as a transport system to ferry any of the gunpowder up to the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, or one of the places it went to. And there was actually quite a bad accident using one of these ferries that, fortunately, not too many people were killed, but it did blow up on. And that's one of the reasons they used to try and keep the transport off, in effect, the main transportation systems, because then it was extra safe. Anyhow, I was just standing there reading the information plaques that are dotted around. It's an incredibly well laid out museum, for want of a better word. It's very, very well laid out. And I was reading this one, and my son was watching the swans and everything else that was wandering and milling about. Well, there's a building, excuse me, just opposite one of these canals, and it's derelict, and you don't get to go in and look at it. And all I could sense was there was women moving around in it. That's the only thing I can explain. I could see sort of, it made you feel like there was a woman there, and then it made me feel like a woman was watching me and smiling, and I was across the other side. Now, when I looked into what this building was, because it isn't one that you could go in and visit, it was actually one of the new mills that was constructed in World War One as part of the cordite works, which is where a lot of the women and the canary girls would have worked during World War One. And I must admit, I got this sense well before I actually knew what this building was, because I didn't find out what this building was until I went back to the main museum housing, if you like, and asked about this building that wasn't really that well documented. So it's definite that there is a very feminine presence on that site, which is possibly why it does feel as peaceful as it does. Now, as I said, there isn't actually that much evidence out there. There's no real EVPs that I found on YouTube or on different paranormal websites. There's not even that many people who've encountered stuff there, other than sort of short bursts of saying that they visited it, it was interesting. The chap that I mentioned earlier, who I don't know their name, so I can't give them the credit, that saw the shadows moving around and running fast. But the fact that there is noise in the places that would have been very industrious, they would have been very procedural, to try and, you can imagine in somewhere as dangerous as that, procedures were the thing that kept people, well, kept them alive a lot of the time. There would have been a lot of pressure on them. and the fact that there's a very strong feminine presence there would be indicative of the munitionettes and the Canary Girls who were associated there. Sometimes with a feminine presence it can be because it's spouses and widows looking for their loved ones. It's not the sense that I've got, and I don't think it's the sense that a lot of people, such as Steve has mentioned in his ghost hunt events. I do think it's interesting though that you have a cheeky fireman in the Mad Lab. I think next time I go there, possibly over the summer holidays with my children, I might hang around, because who doesn't love a cheeky fireman? But being a fireman in a place like that, you would have had to have a bit of a dark sense of humour, I think, and you probably would have had to have been quite cheeky, because what a dangerous job. You get told there's a fire in one of those mills and you may not come out of it after it explodes. Really scary. But if you have been there, if you have had an experience at the Gunpowder Mills, I would love to hear from you, and I would be more than happy to talk about it on future shows when we maybe revisit some of the areas that we've talked about and talk through new evidence that we've discovered since we last visited them. But do go and check out Ghost Hunt Events on Facebook. They've got some really, really brilliant places coming up that you can go and see. For example, in September, they've got a few forts coming up. They've got a couple of houses. They've got the Red Lion Hotel in Colchester, which is meant to have loads and loads of history about it. Charlton House, a very infamous one in London. Loads of places, but go and check them out, because, as I say, they've been incredibly helpful for me putting this show together and being kind enough to share their information and evidence from their investigations. So that pretty much brings my whistle-stop tour to the Gunpowder Mills in Waltham Abbey to an end. I'm sure it's some kind of era that we'll visit again soon, especially with there being so many of the munition works being, well, quite local to me, in all honesty. And it wouldn't surprise me if there are more tales to be told about some of the ones such as Faversham and places like that. Next week I'm going to be joined by the lovely Dee Dee Mason from Goth Angel Productions, and we're going to be talking about Coventry. Now, don't worry, it's going to be fascinating. There's a lot of things about Coventry I bet you never even knew. And Dee Dee works for the Heritage Centre, so her knowledge of history is incredibly good, and we're going to have a whale of a time talking about all the different things that Coventry has experienced. We're going to be looking at the Watch Museum, because Coventry had a watch industry, and it's a very interesting place with a lot of paranormal activity. And we're also going to look at the World War II Coventry Blitz, which you may or may not have heard of. The week after that, I'm going to be chatting with Simon Entwistle of Top Hat Tours, and we're going to be looking at the Pendle Witches from Lancashire, one that I'm really looking forward to, because Simon is a wealth of knowledge on this subject, so it should be a very interesting show. But as ever, if you have anything that you want to add to the show, so if there is anything else that you'd like to talk about, please do let us know. Please contact Parasearch you can come through our website, you can go through our Facebook page, and let us know any areas that you think would make a good show. Don't forget, loads of shows on, everything you could possibly want to listen to do with the paranormal, and we always welcome your feedback. So on that note, I think it's time for me to sign off. But do remember that, not everything is bad, and have a good evening, and sleep tight. And don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.